Oh, it started again. I thought it was like, it's enough. Okay, so off we go. So in terms of climate change, and again, apologies for telling you things you know, but my sort of summary on that is really to say, well, climate change is at its sort of most basic, we're saying this is, the human causation of an increase in the average global temperature. Yeah, and then the impact on climate as a result of that sort of medium and longer term increase in temperature. And so we talk about the Holocene or anthropogenic, meaning sort of human causation of this phenomenon. So at the highest level, that's what we're talking about. So the mechanism for that, or the primary mechanism for that, is what they call the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is a very nice metaphor because, we think of a greenhouse, you think of the sun coming through the glass, you think of the air and the ground within the greenhouse heating up, and then the air doesn't have anywhere to go. So it gets warmer. And you get into a greenhouse and it's warm, and then you leave the door open and it dissipates and it gets down to normal temperature again. So in the same way, we have the greenhouse again, greenhouse impact. Greenhouse gases create the same impact in our atmosphere. And so greenhouse gases, and we'll come to that in 2 minutes, basically, as they get created, they then create something which approximates that glass in a greenhouse. So the sun comes through it because it's transparent. But unfortunately, it has the ability to stop that heat then escaping. And then as a result of that, we get a warmer planet just as the greenhouse gas warms. And so it's just as the greenhouse warms. So for me, it's a beautiful metaphor. It's a very clear one. It's a very obvious one. And so what is that gas? So that gas is primarily, but not exclusively, carbon dioxide and methane. And where does that gas come from? It comes, again, primarily, but not exclusively, from the burning of fossil fuels. And so when you burn coal, when you burn oil, or you combust oil, when you burn gas for cooking or whatever, or heating, all of those things give off CO2 and some of them give off methane. And those aren't the only causes, but those are the primary ones. And of course, that is something that we humans do. So we've used those, the fuel, basically, in order to power electricity, power mobility, power industrial processes, to build things, to create things, and indeed in agriculture as well. And in the song, they talked about cows farting. So there are other causes of these greenhouse gases, and one is agriculture and livestock. So livestock, they chew the cuds, they emit lots of methane. That is another primary cause or source of methane. So we have the greenhouse gas impact. Then we have the creation of greenhouse gases through this system of fuel and power that we've built our economies on over the last 100 years, which is really through combusting fossil fuel. That's what we've done. And then we find it everywhere. And we find it, in almost anything we can touch or feel. We find out that in some shape or form, there's been some impact, either because it was created using electricity, which was powered by the burning of fossil fuel, or maybe it was built out of plastics, which is derived from fossil fuel, or whatever else it might be. So it's ubiquitous, basically, because that's how we've built our system. That's powered economic growth. That's powered, of course, geopolitics as well. And I mentioned a few of the sectors, but the obvious sectors, the biggest sector is power production. So the production of electricity, which in many economies has and still is coal-based. So if we think about India, if we think about China, if we think about many other economies, you've still got coal being used to burn in order to create power. That's one. So industrial processes. So there are many industrial processes, particularly the creation of steel, the creation of concrete, which we don't really have alternatives for at the moment. So these are, again, the chemical process of those productions emit greenhouse gases. Mobility. So if we think of cars or planes, even public transport, then public transport to a lesser degree, but certainly cars and planes. So, typically we've got internal combustion engines. You poke fuel into them and they burn that fuel and it comes out of the exhaust and we put CO2 in the air. I mentioned agriculture. So all of the big sectors, we can see that they emit. And of course, we are consumers of what those sectors produce. So there's sort of both sides of the coin. So why is this such a big issue? So, okay, we've got this sort of heating impact. And by the way, the way that that's expressed is typically the percentage, the degrees of increase in temperature since pre-industrial times, which is, generally deemed to be about 150 years ago. And at the moment, it's generally accepted that it's sort of between 1.1 and 1.2 degrees warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution, as was. Okay, so it might not sound a lot, but the impacts have been very significant. And the other challenge about this is it's happened very recently. So yes, it's been creeping up on us, but now we're beginning to really feel the impact. The other challenge about this is that those greenhouse gases stay in the air for many, many years. So even though you might reduce the amount of greenhouse gas you produce, the residual is still there. And so you're adding to it. Even if you produce any greenhouse gas, you're effectively adding to the stock of greenhouse gas in the air. So you're adding to the warming impact, even if you massively reduce the amount of greenhouse gas you produce in some shape or form. So you can see we've got quite a challenge. We've got a huge, great sort of, fossil fuel-based economy and system to turn around. We've got this huge, great inventory or stock of greenhouse gas in the air that we've got to do something about. And yet it's still happening in the same way that it's been happening in the past. And so at the moment, that 1.1 that we've already experienced is expected to be, even with the promises, and we'll get to those promises, but even with the promises, the latest promises that countries made last year to reducing their greenhouse gases, we're still looking at an increase of between 3 and 4%. Sorry, 3 and 4 degrees. So i.e. 3 or 4 times more than the increase we've already sustained. So, okay, so we've got the temperatures going up, but it's the impact on our weather systems, of course, and other impacts, which are really pernicious in the short term, which are really challenging to us in the short term. So let us turn our mind to Pakistan. Let's just have a little bit of a think about that. And of course, Pakistan has been prone to flooding in greater or lesser degrees, but the flooding it's undergone recently is unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable on its scale and its order of magnitude. And whilst a scientist can't say that was absolutely 100% due to global warming, they can say that probability that it was due to that, the probability that those sort of events will increase in ferocity and frequency is proven effectively. So this is impacting like areas bigger than the UK, for instance, bigger than the country that I'm sitting in. And so that's in Pakistan. Pakistan, to many people in the UK, where I am, still feels like a long way away. But across Europe, including the UK, we had heat waves. 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, they finished, but we had heat waves of over 40 degrees. I don't think we've never, there's the highest temperatures we've ever experienced. And if they were one-offs, we'd probably all think, oh, well, that was quite warm. That was interesting. But no, they're not going to be one-offs. They're going to happen frequently and more frequently. And our building stock hasn't been arranged to organize or accommodate that. So it's an issue now, a very obvious issue for us. We had more fires in London than we did since what we call the World War in 1939 to 1945, when it was being bombed, when London was being bombed. So the statistics like this are beginning to be pervasive. And we've read about Australia. We've got our own stories, I'm quite sure, in Lebanon and any other countries represented here. I'm very sure that we're experiencing them. We're seeing them. We're hearing our, particularly people who are older in the family, and maybe parents or maybe grandparents, talk about how things have changed. So we could begin to feel and experience that and realize it's not the issue over there. It's an issue here as well. So the impact of those weather extremes, again, we can sort of see, hear, or experience them. And so one is our very existence. So certainly, there was a lot of coverage, certainly in our part of the world, about the Indian heat wave, which I think finished about, I'm sure it hasn't completely finished, but was particularly bad about 2 or 3 months ago. And of course, a significant proportion of the Indian population don't have AC. Yeah, they don't necessarily have proper shelter. So they're in that heat, living in that heat, and some of them are dying in that heat as well. So the very existence is impacted through heat, through floods, obviously, through fires, through cyclones. The quality of life, because of health, in part, is also impacted, but how we live and how we experience what we're doing. Our livelihoods, if we're farmers, we might see water drying up, or crops, we might have to migrate from where we are. And all of this leads to stress, to potentially migration, and to disruption of what we're doing. So I don't want to be too depressing, and we'll come to the upside in a minute. But these are effectively the challenges that we go step from the top, where we think about, what we're talking about, this greenhouse gas mechanism, where do the greenhouse gases come? What are the implications? It's the warming. How does that impact our weather systems? And I'm no weather person, but you just hear so much about it, and you hear about the melting of the ice caps. These are things that can't be reversed. These are things that we have to live with going forward. And the other thing, I've talked about the impact on people, but of course there's also the impact on the natural world. So again, flora, fauna, so plants, wildlife, they're impacted by many things, including the proliferation of plastic, but they are definitely impacted by warmer temperatures. And so they have to migrate or move further north. Or you get the coral bleaching, for instance, that we're experiencing all over the world because the seas are warmer than they have been. So some very challenging sort of impacts on the way that we've designed our system. So I guess one of the points about all of that is, if anybody's sort of, yeah, but I'm not quite sure, or don't just ignore them, but go back to them and help them understand. Yeah? And one of the sources of the evidence from all of that is, and I'd like you to direct, and it's on our website, we've just paraphrased it, but it is the IPCC, so the International Panel on Climate Change. So this is a group of independent scientists convened by the UN in order to advise governments on what to do about climate change. So what they do is that they create these documents and these reports. Every 8 years, there's a massive, great report in 3 different parts, and they create these reports, and you get hundreds of experts involved. And then they present this to the governments, and then the governments all sort of mark it up and say, don't believe this, don't believe that, demonstrate that. So it goes through that process of cleansing. Notwithstanding that, and of course you can imagine if there's something relatively controversial there, it would probably be taken out by somebody. But notwithstanding that, we've had, just before COP26 last year, and then this year we've had 2 more volumes, we've had the latest report of the International Panel on Climate Change published. We'll have a summary published this month. And they are quite challenging. And everything I've said is really a softer version from that document. And there's a huge amount of detail, but there are summaries that you can read. And you can also read what the UN Secretary General and Antonio Guterres. So I wouldn't necessarily describe him as an activist or a revolutionary or an extremist. But when he describes what's in those reports, he described the first one famously last August as a code red for humanity, the highest level of emergency. The second report, nothing really happened between then and the second report. The second report, which is in February this year, so the first one was all around sort of the science base. The second was about impact and how to adapt to them and who's vulnerable. And he said, I've seen many reports, but nothing like the new climate report. It's an atlas of human suffering and damning indictment of failed climate leadership. People are anxious and angry, and I am too. We need to turn the rage into climate action. And there is the answer, I think, to our concern. We should not be concerned. We should be concerned, and we need to be concerned, but we turn it into action, and through action, we feel better about it. Or we feel better about ourselves because we're doing something in response. And just to round this off, on the third report, so this was about mitigation of climate change. So this is really about reducing the CO2 and the cause of climate change, which is that fossil fuel, the fossil fuel burning. So, and what he said about that, the report is a litany of broken climate promises. Some governments and business leaders are saying one thing, but doing another. They are lying. It's time to stop burning our planet. So this isn't, WWF, it's not an environmental NGO. This is the head of the UN. So please just reflect on that. Do look up those reports, just the summaries, and recognize that there you have the best composite, balanced a representation of what climate change really is than anywhere else. Okay, so having had that sort of uplifting part of the story, so now perhaps we just move on to what people are actually doing about it. So of course, lots of things are being done about it. So notwithstanding, we're still, experiencing continuation of global warming at the moment, people are doing things about it. And the way we've talked about climate action in the initiative I'm running at the moment is in 4 parts. So the first is decarbonisation, which means taking CO2 out of the atmosphere or stop putting it into the atmosphere. So looking at all our systems and recognizing that anything that we burn and create CO2 from has to change. So that's decarbonisation. The second is resilience. So the verb to achieve resilience is adaptation. So what do we do to withstand this? Do we build a wall around our house? Do we, install AC? How do we actually withstand the challenges that adverse climate is going to have on us? So the second is resilience, which just stems from adaptation. The third is justice, which says, how do we do this in a way where the least well-off don't suffer? How do we make it fair? How do we make sure that the people on the street in wherever it might be, Delhi, aren't the ones who suffer the most? They've contributed the least. Why should they suffer the most? And then the fourth is circularity, which says, as we think about our replacement systems, be they cars or new power systems or different things that we consume, we just need to make sure that we don't replace what we've got in the past, which is causing us problems, with something which also has problems going forward. And so the concept of circularity, which I'm sure will be familiar to all of you, is really a closed system which doesn't have waste. So the idea is you wear your clothes and then they get passed on and they get repaired and they get, reworn by somebody or reloved. And then in the end, they get reprocessed and they come back and they become a new source of input into new clothes. And so the idea is that you get this closed loops in all the different things, the manufacturing, the processes, the services, the products that we produce. And so what we don't do is just take things out of the environment, imagine that we've got infinite resource and create this huge negative externalities. So just very quickly, in terms of decarbonisation, so this, you might have heard the word net zero. The idea of net zero is to try and get to a position, whether you're a company or a country or the world, to a point by 2050, and this is what the Paris Agreement of 2016 came out with, to get to a point where we don't really add any more CO2 into the atmosphere, okay, by 2050, net zero. So super important for decarbonisation. The main thrust really of decarbonisation is about energy transition. So how do we use other things to create electricity? And of course, in Lebanon particularly, you've got lots of solar and you've got, there's a hope that actually you've got a more constant source of energy in solar. But it's also wind. We've got a lot of wind in the UK, but there's wave power, which is more expensive at the moment, but it'll come into its own eventually. There's nuclear, went out of popularity, but now people are coming back into nuclear, thinking maybe this is part of the answer. So the energy transition is absolutely critical. And then, of course, if we're going to then change things to be powered by renewable powered electricity, then that changes some of those goods. So we go to electric vehicles and away from petrol powered vehicles. We can think about food production. Again, we talked about that being a source of GHG. So people are moving to vegan diets or less meat in their diets. There's less methane and less CO2 in the production of crops and soy or whatever than there is in terms of cows and livestock. And there's also lots of innovation around the industrial processes. So good things are happening. Countries are committing. So some countries in the UK in the 2018, we've actually got an act which commits us to net zero by 2050. Whether or not we'll do it is a different question, but we do have an act at least. It's in law. We also have lots of national governments and local governments and cities talking about climate emergencies. And the climate emergency is pretty much the same thing, which says, look, we've all got to recognize it's an emergency and we want to drive to net zero over time. So lots happening around decarbonisation. It's not enough. We're not doing enough, but it is happening and there's lots of good things happening. And so helping promote that, understand it, work in those industries, trying to get it all scaled, super important. The second is in terms of resilience. So resilience is a more difficult concept than decarbonisation. Decarbonisation, the enemy is CO2. Stop CO2 being emitted. Resilience is more difficult because resilience is a broader concept of how do we prepare and to withstand the challenges of different climate in the future when we don't really know what it is. So it's much more difficult to understand. But generally, there is a hope that by investing in, natural hedges against climate change, and so by that might mean, mangrove swamps or trees in cities, etc., then the hope there is that we contribute to reducing biodiversity loss, but we also create a better natural environment, which helps us to withstand and be resilient against climate change. If all we do is build big concrete walls against the increase in the sea levels, it's not going to end well. So we don't really have companies doing so much on that. We do have countries doing some work on that. And it's really, really challenging as a concept, because very often the people suffering, the people who need to be more resilient, are not the people who've been consuming the most or living in the systems producing the most CO2. So that gets us to justice. So justice is super interesting here because, should Tanzania, as an example, which is where I spent 6 years of my life, should Tanzania be allowed to exploit its natural gas stockpiles? So that's 20 or 30 years of huge economic contribution potentially from natural gas. Should they be allowed to or not? Big question. And if not, shouldn't we pay them not to exploit it? Because it's bad for everybody if they exploit it. But we can't just tell them not to. They've been, one of the poorest countries. They're not anymore, but they used to be one of the poorest countries in the world. They haven't created the issue. And then, there's pressure on them not to exploit that gas. So you can see that justice takes all sorts of different guises. But the bottom line in justice is that the people suffering in Pakistan and in Tanzania, in Lebanon, anywhere else, very often are not the people who've caused the issue. And so therefore, how does that work? How do we square the circle on that to make sure they don't suffer? And then just 2 seconds on circularity. Some sectors in circularity do quite well, and many don't. So obviously the fashion industry is thinking very hard about it. Some parts of the fashion industry do quite well. You've got some parts of the IT industry thinking about e-waste as well. But then many of us haven't really thought about circularity very much, and it's relevant to everything we do, as I mentioned. So just on to COP very briefly. And by the way, I'm nobody's shouting at me, so please, you might all be asleep or having tea, but please do shout, because I recognize I'm talking a lot. So please shout and ask questions, and interrupt at any stage. So just in terms of COP quickly, COP is super important because COP is convened by the UN. It's got all the UN, countries involved in thinking about climate change and thinking about the policy that needs to be put in place to address climate change. Now, I'm new to this, as I explained. I've only been really looking at climate change for 3 or 4 years, seriously. And it's staggering to think that COP's been around for so long. It's called COP27 this year because there's been 27 COPs with one missed for COVID. So that's 28 years of this being such a big issue. The UN has got a separate convening, annual conference to bring all the countries together to talk about it. So it gives you a sense of the passage of time, how important it's been, and how challenging it is to actually do anything here. So 2015, I mentioned, is massive. But since 2015, we've sort of gone backwards in many respects. I think we've gone forward in terms of capability to address it, but we've gone backwards in terms of the amount of CO2 actually in the air.
I have a small question.
Please.
Now that you talk about it, I know we all know about climate change, but now we know how code red it is. But how big can we contribute to reversing that or having a positive change, given the huge industries that are affecting that negatively? So just to give us a little positive glimpse of how can we start doing that?
Yeah, and I think so what we're trying to do on Water COP27 is to try and create a mechanism to give people a voice and a reason to get together. And I think if nothing else, it's us getting together and expressing the desire to change. And that might mean, it depends on the political system you're in, but every political system ultimately needs to satisfy its people to some or to a greater or lesser degree. Yeah? And so us expressing what we need, us exploring where that changes, us choosing, industries and jobs and things to study that are meaningful, and not, being silenced by people who say, oh, that's boring, I'd rather talk about something else. No, but thinking about this, and do not underestimate the impact you can have. We don't know the impact we're having. We don't know, that one person you talk to might then talk to 100,000 other people. That might be the next Greta, or you might be the next Greta. So you just don't know where you're going to go. So lay down the options that create serendipity, that might mean what you say, what you do has the most enormous impact. Believe in that. It could do. We don't know. So do. So the voice is important, but also small actions. So if for me, the small, the not so small actions, I sit in a system, I'm lucky enough to have my own house. I need to insulate it. I need to put solar panels on it. I need to think about, instead of having an old car, which I didn't really think caused anybody any issues, and it would be better to replace it, to keep it, because rather than, have a new car, which would have more carbon, I found out that even though it's a very small car, it emits massively compared to the new cars and the more efficient ones. So small things like that, but don't just do it and keep quiet about it, whatever you do, or helping with recycling at a school or at home or whatever it might be. But those things, and us learning about them and getting skilled and talking to other people about them, is a huge contribution. And if we all do that, it's going to be massive, and things will change. And if we choose and we consume on that basis as well, then I think that really helps as well.
So we have a question in the chat from Sabine. What one quote related to climate change, to climate action, that you would like to address to everyone?
Okay, let me answer that right at the end, or I might even have to send it an email, having thought about it a bit harder.
Okay.
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. Okay, so we'll come to that in a minute. But so just very quickly going on about COP and then COP27. So COP27, really important. Why? Because it's talked about as the African COP. Obviously, Africa is one of the continents which has been most challenged or by the adverse impacts. So super important. It's also because all the countries are supposed to halve their emissions by 2030 to meet the Paris Agreement. And at the moment, the country plans, called the nationally defined contributions, don't do that. So we're hoping that the countries will turn up with more plans, better plans, more ambitious plans. That's really important. We hope that the financing, the money available for the countries which are suffering the most, is going to double. Sorry. The money that has been promised, which is 100 billion a year, will be funded, and then the amount which is spent on resilience as opposed to decarbonisation will double. So really important things. And we also hope that the concept of loss and damage, so this concept that some people, are due reparation because they didn't cause the issue that they're sustaining and being challenged, becomes a formal concept and is blessed in the COP. So really important to look at it. But for me, the sort of crucially important thing for us is that we're aware that it's happening. And, again, I'm not a policy expert. I doubt any of you are. But that doesn't really matter, because once a year, we have an opportunity to rally around this and to show people that we care about it. So yeah, we have another question in the chat.
How can we as youth who believe in the importance of action against climate change and living in a very challenging time, especially economically, convince people to follow just actions, for example, the 3 R's, and all what they are thinking of is to afford their basic needs?
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult when people have limited choice. So if, for instance, you are being shelled and you are in a war situation, then all you're going to be thinking about is survival and protection of your family and children. So without a doubt, depending on the short-term severity of other challenges and issues, you just can't accommodate, and you can't think about some of these longer-term things. You can't do it. And I think we've all got to understand that. That means that those of us who can think about it have to think doubly or triply. But it also means, sorry, go on.
Yeah, it's just, I want to answer that question as well when you're done from it. In a brief
and I was just going to say, but I think also, and increasingly, part of the good news story here is that some of the alternatives are actually cheaper or more resilient or better. And so, for instance, in Lebanon, community-based solar energy is an amazing thing. So you're not necessarily dependent on, it's not cheap necessarily to put in, but you're not dependent anymore on a grid that doesn't necessarily work. You're not subject to massive price increases that you don't know why and where they've come from. And you will, of course, need battery storage to make sure it's consistent energy that you receive, but you're in more control, it's cheaper, and it's less political. So I think, there are bits and pieces of the solutions coming together, which should help everybody, albeit I do recognize if you've got short-term, very pressing, urgent existential challenges, those are the ones you're going to focus on.
Yeah, so for us in Shabab Lab, we teach social innovation all the time, and we always see opportunities and challenges and in the hardest times. And from me, talking from a situation that I live in, during these challenging times, we had a lot of startups that started doing recycling because they started seeing an opportunity. They started making money out of plastic, and in the way they started contributing positively to climate change, maybe without even thinking about it. So if we want to think about contributing to climate change, it doesn't mean that our financials would affect that in a negative way. So we shouldn't put responsibility on the situation that is around us. We can contribute regardless of the situation. And when we take the responsibility upon ourselves to be positive in our community, regardless of anything, we can find a way despite the challenging times that we're living in. So that's it.
Nicely spoken. So just keeping an eye on the clock here. So to doing something, could you put up my slide and can I please talk about Water COP27?
Sure. There it is.
All right. Okay. So this is, what I'm doing, highly imperfect. I'm trying to do something really to make myself feel better, right? So this year I've been focusing on Water COP27. I talked about Water COP26 before. And this is the framing of this initiative. So down the left-hand side, the objectives of this initiative are threefold. So one is to try and create an opportunity to learn. So I can learn from others, they can learn from me, hopefully, but everybody can bring a project, an idea, something to the table, and we can learn from each other. So that's one important thing. The second is building a sense of solidarity. So whether we're, rich, poor, advantaged, disadvantaged, old, young, blah, 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 but there's a sense of solidarity because we all care about this and we're all trying to do something about it. And the third is connections. So if we can facilitate the creation of connections, again, across all these different domains, and those are useful in the fight against climate, fantastic. We feel like we've done a good job. So those are the objectives. The outcomes I've talked about. So when we think about climate action, we're thinking about those 4 outcomes. So I won't talk about those again. And then the activities. So the sort of the pillars of this, it is all about mass participation and engagement. So we try to design something which lots of people can get involved in order to meet those 3 objectives. And so the activities, the first one is getting on an app and tracking the distance you walk or you walk, you run, or you travel in a wheelchair, or you cycle. Okay, so you do that distance over 45 days, starting on Thursday this month. I mean, if you're late to register, you can register afterwards, but starting on the 22nd, register on the app, log your distance together in a team of friends or people from your organization or school or whatever, and I will plant trees on your behalf through the Jane Goodall Institute, okay? And in addition to that, we hope that you will feel, that sense of collective action against climate change, and you might organize your own events, and you might go on the Lebanese Mountain Trail or whatever else you might do. The second part to this is town halls. So in order to keep the sense of a journey alive, because nobody's actually walking from Scotland down to Egypt, in our initiative anyway. So we have these 12 town halls. And so they start in Scotland on Thursday. They are hybrid or virtual, so people can listen in and understand. And the idea is that you will learn about the local climate challenges and the responses to them. And in the 12 countries all the way down, including Lebanon, and on the 27th of the 10th of October, we have our one in Lebanon. So please do put that in the diary. The third thing is Clubhouse sessions. So you may or may not be familiar with Clubhouse. So it's a simple social media app, which allows you just to listen in on conversations or host a conversation or speak. And so we've got an inventory of participant-led sessions. So any of you who've got an interesting opinion on climate change or one you want to practice talking about, set up or tell me, click on the link on the website, and then I'll set up a session and we'll moderate it, and we'll have a fantastic conversation, and we'll promote it. You can promote it to your people, and through that we can identify, we can attack our sort of learning objective. And then the final thing is social media, trying to amplify what people are doing. So when we find good examples or good organizations doing good things, let's post something together, get the story going. And so all of this sort of adds to this idea of this big collective of not putting what we're doing at the top, but really creating the opportunity for us to facilitate those things that are happening, be that a school project, a university decarbonization thing, an organizational thing, whatever. Okay, so the actions on the right, very specific actions. So first of all, please click on that link and register. So that registration is about getting you on Atlas Go, so your distance can be tracked and walked, then we can plant the trees. And that also allows us to tell you what's happening as well. So please register. The second is put the Lebanese town hall in the diary. You please also attend the other town halls, but that's particularly important for this conversation. The third is do seriously consider joining one of the Clubhouse sessions. And if you're not sure, maybe listen into a few and then decide whether or not you want to do that. It might be something you can speak about anyway. It might be something that you want to do a bit of research around. And then finally, obviously, please do get on social media, repost, reshare, see what we're doing. And we're trying to put everything, or get everybody to put it under a hashtag Walk to COP27. So please join us, but please use this in order to deliver what you want to deliver in the fight against climate change. So thank you. I know there's a question in there still, which is this really difficult one, which is what is the one quote? What was it again?
Yeah, so what's the one quote that you related to climate action that you'd like to address to everyone?
Okay. So it is, and it's not a quote, unfortunately, but it's a sentiment. Okay, so I'll go and try and refine it, so I might be able to answer that question probably next time. But the sentiment is that we do need system change, but the only way we get system change is by getting everybody involved. So that would be the sentiment. And let me try and think how to say that properly some other time. Right. Let's have some questions, guys. So sorry, apologies for boring on, but
well, I have as well an announcement that we have an event happening on the 25th of September. You can join it. It's Run for Able, specifically running for disabled needs. It's happening in Beirut. So if you want to register, I'm going to leave you the link in the chat as I left the links that Sam shared. So this can be counted for the COP27 Lebanon. So if you register, and you can register this action, in contribution to climate change. So if anyone has questions about registration, about the attendance for the Lebanon Town Hall, about COP27, about anything that we mentioned today, just feel free to unmute and ask.
okay, there we are. Well, Sabine, thank you. So you asked the question, Sabine. So what do you think? have you got a one to offer yourself, perhaps? No. Okay, then I know it's tricky. It is tricky. All right, Adnan, are you still on? You've said thank you. Thank you. Any reflections or comments from your side?
So let's try in the chat who's in the COP27 and in registering their action towards climate change, who's in for that?
Exactly. Come on, everybody.
Thanks, Nai.
Sabine's in. Yes, great. Gabby.
And Naveen.
Very good. Excellent. And by the way, everybody, if you have any issues getting into the app, the only issue really that anybody has is they don't think they need to read the instructions on the website, which is simple, by the way. They go straight to the app, they download it, and then they can't find Walk to COP27. So please do just have a quick peek at the instructions on the website. It doesn't take more than a few minutes, as long as you don't do the app first and then you can't find the initiative. But if you do have an issue, just mail me directly. In fact, I will put my...
Thank you so much for this fruitful discussion. And I would like to say that I totally agree that kids are the main fighters against climate change by recycling. And I witnessed that, and I have been seeing that at scout movements and at schools. They were really excited to bring plastics with them for environmental organizations to pick them up for recycling.
Yeah, well spoken. Yeah, and just to add to that, I found that in the meetings that we held, walking up to Glasgow, people behaved themselves when there were young people there. And not only that, but the young people were all confident on this particular topic. So somehow, have we been talking about, I don't know, vacations or jobs or I don't know, almost anything, then the older people with more experience would be yakking on and the young people would be sitting there, but just absolutely didn't happen. It completely reversed. So totally agree with the sentiment that was just expressed.
All right, so thank you so much, Sam. It's
Pleasure.
been a great talk. Thank you for highlighting the code red again for climate change, and hopefully we can have a positive contribution towards that. And thanks you for giving us the tools how to be part of this action. So hopefully we'll see you later. Hopefully we'll see you in Lebanon on the 27th, and have a great day. So thanks everyone for being here today, and looking forward to seeing you, contributing on social media and showing your actions toward climate action.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. And
thank you, everyone. Have a good
see you on